There's a kind of silence that only the West Texas plains know, a silence so vast, so absolute, that it feels like the whole earth is holding its breath. It is the silence before a storm tears the sky apart. It is the silence before a gunshot shatters the morning. And it is the silence of a woman who has been told one too many times that she is nothing. Clara May Whitfield knew that silence better than she knew her own name. She had lived inside it for 7 long, aching years, locked behind the gilded bars of a marriage that looked like grace from the outside and felt like a grave from within. Every morning she woke to the sound of her husband's boots on the hardwood floor and knew, without looking, exactly what kind of day it would be. The kind where she walked on eggshells, the kind where every word she said would be twisted and used against her, the kind where she wondered, for just a breath, just a heartbeat, whether she truly was as broken as he kept telling her she was. But something was stirring in Clara May, something old and stubborn and fiercer than fear. And on the morning of September the 3rd, in the year of our Lord 1884, with the sun barely risen over the red rock mesas of West Texas, Clara May Whitfield made a decision that would change everything. She was going to run, and she wasn't going to run alone. What follows is a story of 3 souls, bruised, scarred, and searching, who find in each other what they could not find alone: the courage to face the past, the strength to fight for freedom, and the grace to believe that even the most broken things can be made whole again. Brace yourself. This is not a gentle story, but I promise you it is a true one. True in the way that only the best stories are. True to the bone, true to the heart, and true to the God who never stopped watching over every desperate mile of their journey. Friends, if you are watching for the first time, welcome home. This channel, The Blessed Christian Storyteller, exists for one reason: to remind you that God is in every story, even the ones that hurt. If this story moves your heart, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Now settle in, because the story is just beginning. The Whitfield estate sat on the edge of Caldwell Creek like a man who had decided he owned the water. 3 stories of whitewashed brick, a wraparound porch lined with morning glories that nobody had ever actually planted, and windows that caught the light just so. The kind of windows that made people on the road slow their horses and say, "My, would you look at that?" It was the finest home in Reyes County, Texas, and everyone said so. Everyone also said that Edmund Whitfield was a fine man, a prosperous man, a God-fearing man who gave generously to the Baptist church and always tipped his hat to ladies in the street. Everyone was wrong. Clara May sat at the vanity in her bedroom on the 3rd floor, pressing a cool cloth to the bruise that had blossomed purple and yellow along her left cheekbone sometime in the night. She did not remember exactly when it had happened. That was the thing about Edmund's anger. It came so fast and went so quiet that by morning it felt like something she might have imagined, except for the bruise. You couldn't imagine a bruise. She was 31 years old. She had once been described as the most beautiful girl in Reyes County, with her dark copper hair and her eyes the color of creek water after a summer rain, gray-green and deep, and full of something that men had called mystery and Edmund had called defiance. She had married him at 24, in the full bloom of what she had believed was love. She had been wrong about that too. The marriage had seemed like salvation at first. Her family was struggling. Her father had died of fever, leaving her mother and 3 younger sisters on a failing cotton farm, and Edmund Whitfield had arrived like an answer to a prayer she had not yet prayed. He was handsome. He was wealthy. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. She had said yes to his proposal after 3 weeks of courtship, and her mother had wept with gratitude, and everyone had said, "What a blessing, what a gift from God." The gifts stopped after the wedding. It had been gradual, the way Edmund's love curdled into control. First, it was small things. He didn't like the dress she wore to the Founders' Day celebration. He thought the way she laughed too loud was unbecoming. He preferred she not ride horses anymore. It wasn't ladylike. Then it became larger things. She was not to speak to certain people without his permission. She was not to correspond with her sisters without showing him the letters first. She was not to leave the estate without his escort. And when Clara May had, in a burst of desperate courage 6 months into the marriage, told him that this was not right, not normal, not the life she had agreed to, Edmund had looked at her with those cold gray eyes and said very quietly that she was clearly unwell. That had been the first time he had mentioned the asylum. The Whitfield Sanitarium was in San Antonio, a private institution that Edmund's family had endowed 3 generations back. It was widely regarded as a respectable establishment, a place for troubled souls who needed rest and guidance. What it actually was, Clara May had learned from the whispered horror stories of women who had visited relatives there, was a place where inconvenient women were sent to disappear. You went in alive, and you came out, if you came out at all, empty. Edmund had sent her there once already, 2 years ago, after she had tried to leave, had packed a bag in the dead of night and gotten as far as the road into Reyes County before her foreman had intercepted her and brought her back weeping. Edmund had signed the papers within the week. She had spent 4 months inside those whitewashed walls, surrounded by women who stared at nothing, and nurses who smiled too brightly, and a doctor named Pembroke who smelled of tobacco and spoke to her like she was a child. She had returned home thinner, hollowed out, and more careful than she had ever been in her life. She had also returned home planning. Today, pressing the cloth to her cheekbone and watching her own eyes in the mirror, Clara May thought, enough. The word had been building in her chest for weeks, like floodwater rising behind a dam. Enough. She could see the shape of what was coming. Edmund had been muttering again about her instability, her irrational behavior, her tendency to hysterics. She knew those words. She knew where they led. The papers would come again. The carriage would come again, and this time she was not sure she would survive it. She opened the small cedar box on her vanity and counted the money she had hidden there over the past year, coins and small bills she had carefully saved from the household accounts, skimming so gently that Edmund had never noticed. $47.30. It was not much, but it was enough to run. She needed help, though. She needed people she could trust. She needed Rowena Callahan. Clara May put down the cloth, straightened her spine, and began to write a letter. 30 miles east of the Whitfield estate, where the scrub oaks grew thick along the banks of the Nueces River and the land rolled in long golden waves towards the horizon, the Callahan homestead sat in the middle of a particular kind of beauty that only looked peaceful from a distance. Rowena Callahan, Row to everyone who knew her, was in the barn at 6:30 in the morning, doing what she had done every morning for the past 11 years, keeping the Callahan operation running while everyone around her pretended not to notice how much she carried. She was 29 years old, broad-shouldered for a woman, with dark auburn hair that she kept braided tight because there was no point in fuss. Her face was the kind of striking that didn't quite know what to do with itself, strong-jawed and high cheekbones, with eyes so dark brown they looked black in certain light, and a mouth that curved easy toward smiling when she was alone, but pressed flat and careful around people she didn't trust. She trusted very few people. She had trusted her father, Samish Callahan, a big, barrel-chested Irishman who came to Texas with nothing but his stubbornness and his faith and built something real out of both. He had been the kind of father who taught his daughter to rope and ride and shoot alongside the boys, who read to her from the Bible every evening by the fire, who told her that a woman with good sense and a good heart could do anything she set her mind to. He had been the best man Roe had ever known. He had died 3 years ago. and the manner of his dying was a wound that had not closed. Ro was thinking about her father. She was almost always thinking about her father when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road and straightened up from the saddle she was mending to peer through the barn door. A rider, coming fast. She recognized, with a complicated twist in her chest, the horse, a paint mare named Calla, belonging to the Whitfield estate. The rider pulled up in the yard, and Rose stepped out of the barn into the morning light. It was one of the Whitfield housegirls, a young Mexican woman named Esperanza, who had worked in Clara's kitchen for years, and who looked, right now, like she had ridden hard and was not finished being frightened. "Miss Callahan," she said, holding out a folded letter. "From Mrs. Whitfield. She says, please, she says it is urgent." Rose took the letter. She broke the seal, a pressed flower, Clara's old signal for something private, and read. Her jaw tightened as her eyes moved down the page. When she finished, she read it again, slower this time, and then she folded it carefully and tucked it inside her shirt. "You'll have breakfast and water your horse before you go back," she told Esperanza, who nodded with relief and slid from the saddle. Rose stood in the yard for a long moment, looking out at the distance. The morning was still cool, the sky that particular shade of pure blue that West Texas offered in September, before the heat came crashing down. She breathed it in. She thought about her father. She thought about Clara May, who had been her closest friend since they were girls of 12, braiding each other's hair and sharing secrets in a hayloft. She thought about the asylum, which Clara had described to her once in a voice so flat and distant that it had been more frightening than screaming. Then she thought about the other thing, the name Clara had mentioned in the letter, the name that hit Ro like a fist every time she heard it, Colt Brannigan. Clara needed both of them, she had written. She needed Colt because he knew the territory between here and the Mexican border better than any man alive, and because he owed Clara a debt of the kind that couldn't be paid in money. And she needed Ro because Ro was the only person in the world she trusted completely. Ro thought about the fact that she had not spoken to Colt Brannigan in 3 years, that the last time she had seen him was at her father's funeral, and she had looked at him standing at the back of the church, hat in his hands, face unreadable, and had felt a rage so cold and so complete that she had turned away before she did something she could not take back. She thought about all of this, and then she thought, Clara May needs me. That was enough. She went inside to pack. Her mother, Pearl Callahan, found her in the bedroom rolling clothes into a saddlebag. Pearl was 53 and still lovely in a tired sort of way, dark-haired like Ro, with eyes that had been crying recently, and a new ring on her left hand that caught the light when she moved. That ring was the other reason Ro had been looking for a door. "Where are you going?" Pearl asked from the doorway. "Clara needs help," said Ro without looking up. A silence. Then Pearl said carefully, "How long?" "I don't know." Another silence, longer, and Ro could feel her mother wanting to say things, wanting to say that she needed Ro here, that Silas Beaumont was coming next week to discuss the wedding arrangements, and she would need Ro's help, that it wasn't right to leave a mother alone. Ro straightened up and finally looked at Pearl, and something in her face must have warned Pearl off, because Pearl only said, very quietly, "Be safe." "Always," said Ro. They did not hug. They had not been hugging lately. There was too much between them, too much grief, and too much new beginning, and too much of the old silence that had settled over this house like dust after Seamus died. Ro saddled her own horse, a big dark bay gelding she called Reckoning, and rode out into the morning. She had one stop to make before she reached the Whitfield estate. She had to find Colt Brannigan, and God help them both. Colt Brannigan was not a man who inspired confidence on first sight, and he knew it. He had made a kind of peace with that fact, the same way he had made a kind of peace with most of the hard facts of his life, by setting his jaw and getting on with it. He was 34, lean and angular like a fence post, with the particular quality of stillness that men who have survived long stretches of danger tend to develop. His face was weathered past his years, marked with a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a souvenir from a night in Laredo he preferred not to think about. His hair was dark, almost black, and he wore it longer than was fashionable because he did not particularly care what was fashionable. His eyes were the color of amber cotton firelight, brown gold and quick and watchful, always watchful, taking in the room from the moment he entered it. He was the kind of man that other men stepped around in bars, and women instinctively watched from a distance, not always sure what they were feeling. He was sitting in the back corner of the Caldwell Crossing Saloon, the Mended Wheel, a modest establishment that served decent whiskey and asked very few questions, wincing his second drink of the morning and reading a 3-day-old newspaper when the door opened and Rowena Callahan walked in. He went very still. The thing about Ro Callahan was that she had a presence, the kind that announced itself before the rest of her arrived. She stood in the saloon doorway for exactly 1 second, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light, and in that second, every man at the bar turned to look at her. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Her eyes were already sweeping the room, and they found him in the corner with the efficiency of a hawk spotting movement in long grass. She crossed the room, she sat down across from him without being invited, which did not surprise him. He looked at her the way she always looked at him now, like she was deciding exactly how much anger to allow herself, and she said, without preamble, "Clara May needs us." Colt set down his whiskey glass. He said nothing. "She's going to run," Rose said. "Edmund is talking about the asylum again. She's terrified, and she's right to be. She needs someone who knows the terrain between here and the border, and she needs someone she trusts." She paused. "She trusts both of us. I don't understand why she still trusts you, for the record." "Ro," he said very quietly. "Don't," she said, equally quiet, but with an edge that could cut glass. "We are not doing that today. Today we are talking about Clara May. You can tell me later what you need to tell me, and I will tell you what I think about it, and it will not be pleasant. But not now. Now I need to know, are you in?" He looked at her for a long moment. She was beautiful in the way that real things were beautiful, the way the land was beautiful, without trying, without apologizing for it. 3 years had put something new in her face, a harder line to her jaw, a gravity around the eyes that hadn't been there before. He thought about Seamus Callahan and felt the familiar weight of it pressing down on his chest, the weight he carried everywhere he went. "I'm in," he said. Something flickered across her face, relief mostly, and underneath that, something more complicated that she tucked away before he could read it fully. "Good," she said. "We ride for the Whitfield estate at noon. And Colt," she stood up, and for just a moment she looked at him with something she almost took for concern before her face closed up again. "There are people looking for you in this county. 3 men rode through Reyes yesterday, asking questions. One of them had Hargrove written all over him." Colt felt the muscles along the back of his neck go tight. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "So whatever trouble you've been sitting on, you'd better tell me about it before it finds us on the road." She walked out. He watched her go, then looked down at his whiskey glass for a long time. The Hargrove family. He had been wondering how long it would take. Apparently, the answer was not long enough. He left 2 coins on the table, folded his newspaper, and went to get his horse. The trouble with Colt Brannigan, the deepest trouble, the one that shadowed everything else, was this. 3 years ago, he made a choice that ended one man's life and saved another's, and he had never been able to explain that choice in a way that satisfied anyone, including himself. He had been a deputy, working under Sheriff Wade Hargrove in the town of Bitter Creek north of the Nueces River. He had been young enough and foolish enough to believe that the law meant justice, and that doing his job meant doing right. He had learned otherwise the night that Seamus Callahan died. Seamus had not been an outlaw. He had been a rancher, a father, a man of bone-deep integrity who had made one mistake. He had witnessed Wade Hargrove take a bride, had seen the whole transaction, clear as daylight, from behind the livery stable where he had been waiting for a horse to be shod. And Seamus, being Seamus, had gone straight to the county judge and reported it. What followed had the look of an accident. Seamus was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, his horse beside him, his neck broken. The official finding was that the horse had stumbled in the dark. Colt had investigated. Colt had found things that didn't add up. A wound on the horse's flank consistent with a blade, not a fall. Boot prints in the dust at the edge of the ravine that didn't belong to Seamus. A button from a coat that matched the one worn by Wade Hargrove's eldest son, Dalton. He had taken this evidence to his superior. His superior had been Wade Hargrove himself. What happened next had cost Colt his badge, his name in that county, and very nearly his life. He had fled Bitter Creek with Hargrove's men behind him. He had managed to get the evidence to a federal judge in San Antonio, a man of genuine integrity, and had given his testimony. The investigation was ongoing. Hargrove was not yet arrested, but he was cornered, and cornered men were the most dangerous kind. And somewhere in all of this, in the chaos and the flight and the desperate months that followed, Ro Callahan had lost her father and had looked at Colt Brannigan and had seen the man who had worked for the sheriff who killed him. She did not know about the evidence. She did not know about the testimony. He had not told her, partly because he didn't know if it would help, and partly because he was not sure he deserved her forgiveness and so had not asked for it. He had been carrying that like a stone in his boot ever since. He saddled his horse, a gray roan named Asylum, and rode toward the Whitfield estate. The morning was heating up fast, the way September mornings in West Texas did, and somewhere in the distance, over the red mesas, thunder was building. The plan was simpler than it had any right to be, which Clara May knew was a warning in itself. While Edmund was away in Reyes for his weekly meeting with his banker, a meeting that consumed the better part of every Wednesday afternoon, Clara would slip out through the kitchen with her saddlebag and Esperanza's help. Ro and Colt would be waiting behind the eastern tree line with fresh horses. They would be on the road to Del Rio before Edmund returned, and from Del Rio they would make for the border, where Clara had an old friend, a woman named Sister Agatha, a nun of the Oblate Order who ran a small mission school and who was, blessedly, the most discreet person Clara May had ever met. The plan was simple. Everything that could go wrong with it was not. It was almost 11 in the morning when Clara May heard the front door open. She was standing in the middle of her bedroom with her saddlebag in her hand, heart hammering so loud she was sure the whole house could hear it. She froze. Edmund's voice downstairs. "I've forgotten the Beaumont contracts. Clara? Clara May." She set the bag behind the wardrobe, straightened her dress, smoothed her hair over the bruise on her cheek, and walked to the top of the stairs. Edmund was in the hallway below, rifling through the desk in the parlor. He was 41, still lean and handsome in the way that cruel men sometimes were, dressed impeccably in a dark suit and a white shirt that cost more than most men in this county made in a month. He looked up at her and she smiled, the careful smile she had perfected over 7 years, the one that said nothing was wrong. "Your contracts are in the left drawer, you remember." He looked, and his face changed slightly, the minuscule relaxation of a man who was always slightly suspicious and had been proven, for the moment, incorrect. He opened the left drawer and found the papers. "You look pale," he said, studying her from across the hallway. "I didn't sleep well," she said. "You've been pacing again." It was not a question. There was something in the way he said it, a studied, clinical concern that she had learned to fear more than his rage, that made her stomach tighten. "I've been speaking with Dr. Pembroke. I think it might be time for another period of rest, Clara." The word rest hit her like cold water. She did not let it show. She simply nodded very slightly and said, "Perhaps you're right, but maybe we can talk about it tonight. You'll be late for your meeting." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She held the smile. She held her breath. "Tonight," he said. He took his contracts and left. Clara counted to 60 after the front door closed. Then she went behind the wardrobe, grabbed her saddlebag, and ran. Esperanza was waiting in the kitchen with a wrapped bundle of food and water canteens and the expression of a woman who was terrified, but had decided that being terrified was acceptable as long as she did the right thing. "He's gone," she whispered. "He's gone. Listen to me." Clara took Esperanza's hands. "You had nothing to do with this. You didn't see anything. If he asks, I went to the garden after he left, and that's the last you saw." Esperanza pressed her lips together and nodded fiercely. Then she pulled Clara into a hug that lasted exactly 1 breath before Clara stepped back, shouldered her bag, and slipped out the back door. The eastern tree line was perhaps 300 yards from the house. Clara walked it at a measured pace, not running, not hurrying, just a woman taking a morning walk, because running would draw eyes. She was sweating by the time she reached the trees, and her heart was a wild thing in her chest. They were there, Roe sitting easy on Reckoning, and Colt Brannigan, whom Clara May had last seen about 8 months ago, briefly, in town, on a gray roan she didn't recognize. A third horse, a calm sorrel mare with a blaze down her nose, waited beside them. Clara May. Roe swung down and took Clara's bag and tied it to the sorrel saddle in 3 efficient movements. Then she cupped Clara's face very gently and looked at the bruise. Something moved through Roe's dark eyes, something so fierce it was almost frightening, and then it was gone, packed away. "You're all right?" Clara said. "I am now." Colt, who had not spoken, dismounted and held the sorrel steady while Clara mounted. He met her eyes briefly and gave her a single nod, the nod of a man acknowledging a debt. Clara nodded back. "We have maybe 4 hours before he knows I'm gone," Clara said as she settled into the saddle. "Possibly less." "Then we'd best not waste them," Colt said, and swung back onto Absalom. They rode south from them. The morning was enormous around them, the sky a bowl of pure blue over the wide red land, the wind carrying the smell of sage and warm rock and the distant promise of rain. Clara May Whitfield, who had not ridden freely in over 2 years, lifted her face to that wind and felt something move through her that she did not have a word for, something between prayer and grief, and the first fragile shoots of something that might in time become hope. Behind them, the Whitfield estate grew small and then disappeared. Clara did not look back. They rode hard for the first 2 hours, not talking much, saving breath and watching the landscape around them for movement that didn't belong. Colt rode point, slightly ahead, eyes constantly sweeping, and Roe rode beside Clara, close enough to steady her if needed, but giving her space enough to breathe. Clara held together better than either of them expected. She had always been strong beneath the softness. That was one of the things about her that Edmund never understood and had punished her for. She rode straight-backed and quiet, and if there were tears, they were behind her eyes, and she kept them there. By early afternoon, they had covered nearly 30 miles, and the land had shifted from the cultivated valleys around Caldwell Creek to wilder territory, mesquite and cedar brake and limestone ridges that caught the light and threw it back hot and white. They stopped at a shallow creek crossing to water the horses, and Clara sat on a flat rock and ate a piece of Esperanza's cornbread, and Rose stood beside the creek looking out at the water, and Colt crouched a little way off and watched the ridgeline, the way he always watched things, quietly, steadily, waiting. It was there, in the noon heat with the cicadas screaming in the brush, that the first rupture happened. Clara, who had been watching the two of them circle each other all morning with the polite caution of people handling explosives, finally said, "Will you please say whatever you need to say to each other? We're going to be together for 3 days at minimum, and this is already making me tired." Roe turned from the water. Her jaw was tight. "There's nothing to say." "There's everything to say," Clara replied, with the particular patience of a woman who had navigated a controlled household and learned to say the hardest things in the calmest voice. "Roe, he came. I asked and he came. That means something." "It means he feels guilty," Roe said flatly. She was not looking at Colt. "It means he knows what his choices cost." "Roe," Colt's voice was steady but careful, a man walking on ice. He stood up slowly. "I know there's nothing I can say that—" "Don't." She turned to face him now, and the full weight of 3 years of grief and fury was in her eyes, controlled but present, terrible and real. "My father was not a careless rider. He did not fall off a ravine in the dark on a road he had ridden 100 times. Someone put him there, and the man who gave that order worked for— You worked for him, Colt. You wore his badge. For 2 years you wore it." "Yes," Colt said. He didn't flinch from it. "I did." "And you didn't see what he was?" A long pause. "I saw pieces of it, not the whole. I told myself—" He stopped, looked down. When he looked back up, his face was stripped of its usual guardedness, and what was underneath was something raw. I told myself I was doing enough good on my own to balance what was wrong around me. I was wrong, and your father paid for it. I know that. I will know that for the rest of my life. The creek ran, the cicadas sang. A hawk turned slow circles above the ridge. Ro looked at him for a very long time. Clara watched her friend's face go through several things: anger, grief, something complicated and reluctant, and then Ro turned back to the water and said, quietly, "Don't think this changes anything." "I don't," he said. But something had shifted, slightly, like a door pushed ajar by a hand that was not quite ready to open it all the way. Clara filed it away and said nothing. They mounted up and rode on. By mid-afternoon, the clouds that had been building over the mesa since morning had organized themselves into something serious, and the wind had swung around from the south, carrying the iron smell of rain. "Storm coming," Colt said. "I see it," Rose said. "There's a way station about 6 miles south, old stage road. Still got a roof last I checked." "When were you last through here?" 6 months ago. "A lot can happen to a roof in 6 months," Rose said, but she touched Reckoning's flank with her heel, and the horse picked up the pace without being asked, because even Reckoning could read weather in West Texas. They made the way station with 20 minutes to spare before the storm hit. It was a low adobe structure, thick-walled and storm-hardened, with a lean-to for the horses and an iron stove inside that still had a handful of old wood beside it. The roof, Ro noted with the ghost of something almost like satisfaction, was intact. 6 months, she said. "I told you," Colt said, and Clara May, watching them, decided that this was probably as close to a truce as she was going to get today. The storm came in like it meant to undo everything. Rain hammered the adobe walls, lightning made the horizon flicker white, and the thunder rolled long and low across the plain, like the voice of something very large that had been patient for a very long time. Inside, Colt lit the stove, while Ro checked the horses, and Clara sat on an old wooden bench and let herself finally, in the privacy of the storm's noise, cry. Not much, not long, just enough to acknowledge that she was frightened, and relieved, and exhausted, and grateful, and still somehow alive. Then she wiped her face and breathed in the smell of burning mesquite and rain on hot earth, and something in her settled. When Ro came back inside, shaking water from her hair, she looked at Clara's face and understood without being told. She sat down beside her on the bench and put her arm around her, and Clara leaned into her shoulder, and they sat like that while the storm raged and the stove ticked, and Colt sat on the floor across from them with his back against the wall, watching the door, keeping watch the way he always did, like a man who had decided that vigilance was the only penance that mattered. None of them knew that 50 miles north, Edmund Whitfield had come home to an empty house, had stood in the silent parlor for 2 full minutes, and then had walked to his desk and written 2 letters, one to the Whitfield Sanitarium and one to a man named Dalton Hargrove. Dalton Hargrove was 36 years old and had been angry for most of them. He was the eldest son of Wade Hargrove, Ray's County's former sheriff, a man who had built his reputation on a foundation of fear and selective enforcement, and the man most responsible for that investigation, the only witness whose testimony had enough weight to sink Wade Hargrove for good, was Colt Brannigan. Dalton had been hunting Colt for 8 months. He was good at hunting, he had his father's patience and his mother's cunning, and a particular gift for violence that he had always considered one of his better qualities. He rode with 2 men, a Mexican gun hand named Vega, who never spoke but was very accurate, and a slow-talking Arkansas boy called Sutter, who was deceptively fast. Together, they had tracked Colt across 3 counties, always slightly behind, always following the stories people told about a scarred man on a gray roan who asked too many questions. The letter from Edmund Whitfield was unexpected, but welcome. Edmund wanted his wife found and returned. For her health, the letter said, in the measured language of a man who had learned to disguise cruelty in medical vocabulary. He was offering $300 for her safe return. He mentioned, in a careful postscript, that he believed she was traveling with Colt. Dalton read the postscript twice and smiled. He sent Edmund Whitfield a reply saying he would look into it, and then told Vega and Sutter to saddle up. They were already south of Ray's, following the fresh trail of 3 horses that a boy at a creek crossing told them about for the price of a nickel. The storm had slowed him briefly, but storms passed. He wasn't worried. He had all the time in the world, and Colt Brannigan had nowhere left to run. Storm broke sometime after midnight, and the silence that followed had the washed, clean quality of new beginnings. Stars came out in shocking numbers over the flat, dark land, and somewhere nearby a nightjar was singing. Clara had fallen asleep on the bench, wrapped in a saddle blanket, her dark hair loose around her shoulders for as long as Ro could remember. She looked younger asleep, or perhaps more accurately, she looked like who she actually was without all the armor she had built for survival. Ro sat on the floor with her back against the bench, keeping watch so Colt could sleep. Except Colt wasn't sleeping. He was sitting across the small room, knees drawn up, amber eyes open and quiet in the dying firelight. "You should rest," Ro said low, not to wake Clara. "So should you," he said. A silence. Outside, the nightjar sang. Ro turned her knife in her hands, an idle habit, the feel of it familiar and grounding, and thought about what he had said earlier at the creek. She had not expected him to stand still under it. She had expected defensiveness, excuses, the kind of explanations that men made when they needed to be right, more than they needed to be honest. She had not expected that bare, unbuffered acknowledgement. "I was wrong. I know that." "Tell me about the evidence," she said. Her voice was quiet and not quite steady. "Clara told me some of it. She heard from the federal judge's clerk. She told me you testified." She paused. "She said you had evidence, that it wasn't just your word against his." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he told it. All of it. The boot prints, the wound on the horse, the button, the investigation that had been grinding forward in San Antonio for 3 years. He told her what it cost him, his badge, his name in that county, 8 months of being hunted by Dalton Hargrove. He told it flatly, without self-pity, in the way that he told most things, as fact, because he had found that the only honest way to carry guilt was to tell the truth about it and let the listener decide what it was worth. Ro was very still. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Her voice was quiet and not quite steady. "Because I didn't know if it would help," he said, "and because I figured I'd rather carry it than put you through hearing it while you were already grieving. I thought it would just be more weight, more cruelty." He stopped, looked down. When he looked back up, his face was stripped of its usual guardedness, and what was underneath was something raw. "I told myself I was doing enough good on my own to balance what was wrong around me. I was wrong, and your father paid for it. I know that. I will know that for the rest of my life." 3 years, she said. "Yes. You've been carrying this for 3 years, and you let me hate you." The word landed between them. He looked up. "You had every right to." "I had the right to the truth," she said. Not angry now. Something more complicated than anger. "You should have told me." "I know," he said. Another silence. Longer. The nightjar had moved off, and now the only sound was the distant, retreating thunder and the slow tick of the cooling stove. "My father liked you," Ro said finally. Her voice had changed, softer, the anger drained out of it, replaced by something that cost more. "He used to say you were the best kind of man, the kind that did right by instinct instead of instruction. He said that was rare." She stopped, swallowed. "I thought he was wrong about you. After he died, I thought maybe he had been wrong about everything, about men, about trust, about—" She stopped again. Colt was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the watchfulness, something quieter and more vulnerable. "He wasn't wrong," Colt said. "He was one of the best men I ever met, and I think about him—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I think about him every single day." The fire had burned to coals. The room was dark and warm and full of the particular intimacy that comes from 2 people telling the truth to each other in the middle of the night. Ro became aware with a sharpness that surprised her of how close they were. How in this small room, in this dark, with her father's name still floating between them like something holy, the world had narrowed to just this. She picked up her knife again. "Get some sleep, Brannigan," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "I've got the watch." He lay down on the dirt floor, using his jacket for a pillow, and she sat with her back against the bench where Clara slept and kept watch through the long dark hours of the night. She did not sleep, but she thought about a great many things that she had not permitted herself to think about in 3 years. Morning came in gold and clean washed, the sky scoured bright by the night's rain. They were back on the road before the dew had fully lifted, the horses fresh after their rest, the world around them steaming softly as the wet earth gave itself back to the sun. Something had changed in the way station, and all 3 of them felt it, though only Clara was willing to remark on it. She rode beside Ro in the early light and said, very quietly so that Colt, 10 yards ahead, scanning the road, would not hear, "You two talked." Ro kept her eyes on the horizon. "We talked." And nothing. We have a job to do." Clara looked at her friend, this woman she had known half her life, this fierce and stubborn and deeply loving person who had never once made her feel like a burden even when she was one, and she smiled. It was the first real smile she had smiled in days. "What?" said Ro. "Nothing," said Clara. "Clara May." "I'm not saying anything." "Good. I'm just noticing that you don't look at him the same way you did yesterday." "I am going to push you off that horse," Ro said without heat. "No, you won't. I'm your only alibi." Clara patted Ro's arm, and Ro made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Ahead, Colt had stopped his horse on the crest of a low rise and was looking south. When they reached him, they saw what he was looking at, a long, flat valley and the distant thread of the road to Del Rio, and at the near edge of the valley, just visible through the cedar brush, the tin roof of what looked like a small settlement. "Braxton Springs," Colt said. "Population about 40. There's a general store, a church, and a livery. We should be able to resupply without attracting too much attention." He paused. "We're also going to need to pick up some information. I want to know if anyone has been asking questions on the road ahead." "I'll ask at the church," Clara said. Both of them looked at her. Churches hear everything, and they ask fewer questions than saloons. This was true enough that neither of them argued. Braxton Springs was smaller than it sounded and bigger than it looked, the kind of place where people had settled because they ran out of road and found, to their surprise, that staying had its own rewards. The church was a whitewashed adobe with a plain wooden cross, and the woman who answered Clara's knock at the parsonage door was a gray-haired widow named Maud Connolly, who had the sharp eyes and the warm hands of someone who had been ministering to people's needs for a very long time. She looked at Clara's bruised cheek. She looked at her eyes. She did not ask any questions. She said, "Come in and have some coffee, dear. You look like you could use a moment of peace." Clara had coffee and conversation, and when she emerged from the parsonage 30 minutes later, she was carrying a jar of preserved peaches that Maud had pressed on her and a piece of information that she had not expected. 3 riders came through yesterday, heading south. 2 of them asked for a man on a gray roan. She told Ro and Colt in the shade of the livery, her voice low. Colt's expression did not change, but Ro saw his hand drop with the practiced ease of long habit to the pistol at his hip. "How far ahead?" Countess asked. "Maybe 12 hours. They camped south of here last night, according to Maud. She saw their fire from her back window." Clara paused. She also said one of them had a Hargrove brand on their saddle. She recognized it because Sheriff Hargrove's men used to ride through here sometimes, and she always knew to lock her door when they did. A silence. Ro was watching Colt. His jaw had tightened and his amber eyes had gone to that particular flat quality she had started to recognize as him doing calculations. She had learned in 24 hours of watching him that he was a better strategist than he looked and a more careful man than his reputation suggested. "They're not ahead of us," he said finally. "They're between us and Del Rio. If they picked up the trail after the storm, they'll be tracking south-southeast, which is the obvious route." He looked at her. There's another way, longer by half a day, goes through the Seco Canyon and comes out west of Del Rio. Rougher terrain, but they won't be looking for us there," Ro finished. "No, they won't." Clara looked between them. The two of them, this man and this woman who had spent 3 years locked in the amber of shared grief and unspoken things, were standing in the shade of a livery stable in a tiny West Texas town, talking over a map drawn in the dirt with a stick, and there was something obvious between them that was almost painful to witness, something that neither of them was going to acknowledge because they were both too proud and too careful and too freshly broken open by the conversations of the night before. "Seco Canyon," Clara said. "Let's go." And Colt, she waited until he looked at her. "I meant what I wrote. I know you've been carrying this for a long time. So have I. And I think God puts people in each other's paths for reasons, even hard ones." He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been grief, or might have been both. He nodded once, and they went to get the horses. The Seco Canyon. Seco Canyon lived up to its name. It was dry and hard and beautiful in the way that beautiful things are when they don't care at all whether you notice them. The walls of pale limestone rose 40 feet on either side of the narrow trail, streaked red and ochre and gold, carved by ancient water into shapes that looked almost intentional, arches and alcoves and the long, smooth curves of a sculptor's hand. The sky was a slash of perfect blue above them, and the only sound was hoof pats on rock and the far-off cry of a canyon wren. They were halfway through the canyon, perhaps 2 miles in, with another mile to go before the walls opened out into the western plain, when Colt raised his fist and stopped. They froze behind him. He sat very still on Asylum, listening. Ro listened too. The way her father had taught, not for one thing, but for everything. The absence of the wren, the distant sound of something, a hoof on stone, a voice above and behind them. "We're being followed," he said very quietly. "How close?" she breathed. "Half a mile, maybe less. They must have read the trail." He turned his head slightly. "There's a side passage about 50 yards ahead. I used it once before. It's tight, but it comes out on a ledge above the main trail." "Good position?" she asked. "Good enough," he said, "but it only fits one. 2 horses maximum." She understood immediately. She looked at Clara. "Clara, you go with Colt. Take the passage, get to the ledge." "And you?" Clara asked. "I'm going back," Ro said. She was already turning reckoning. "I'll slow them down." "Ro?" Colt's voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. "There are 3 of them and 1 of you." "I know," she said. She checked her rifle, a Winchester she had carried for 5 years as reliable as prayer, and settled it in her hands. "I'll be fine. Go." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted too long to be practical. Then he turned. "Come on, Clara May," he said, and they moved forward at a careful pace toward the side passage. Ro turned reckoning around and walked him back the way they had come, toward the sound of hoofbeats echoing in the narrow canyon. She chose a spot where the canyon curved slightly, enough of a bend to give her a moment of cover, and she dismounted and tied reckoning to a scrub oak and stepped behind a limestone outcrop with her rifle in her hands. She waited. The waiting was the hard part. The waiting was always the hard part, the space between knowing something was coming and seeing it arrive, where fear lived and where courage had to choose whether it was going to show up. Ro breathed. She thought about her father, who had taught her to shoot by setting tin cans on a fence rail and telling her, "Don't close your eyes when you pull the trigger, Rowena. Look at what you're doing. Always look at what you're doing." She heard them before she saw them. 3 horses, coming at a steady pace, not galloping, which meant they weren't sure what they'd find. Smart enough to be cautious. That was useful information. The first rider came around the bend and Ro said, loud and clear, "Stop there." He stopped. The other 2 piled up behind him, 3 men on good horses, all of them armed, all of them squinting into the canyon shadows where Ro was standing with a Winchester aimed at the lead rider's chest. The lead rider was Dalton Hargrove. She knew him, had seen him twice before, recognized the particular set of his shoulders and the cold calculation in his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, the way confident men smiled when they thought they held all the cards. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Rowena Callahan. I heard you were riding with Brannigan. I didn't expect this." He gestured vaguely at her and the rifle. "You're on the wrong road," Roe said. "Turn around." "I don't think so," he said pleasantly. "I've got a piece of paper from Reyes County authorizing me to recover a woman named Clara Whitfield, who's been declared mentally incompetent by her husband and her physician. That gives me the right to search this canyon." "That paper doesn't mean anything south of Reyes County line," Roe said, "and you know it. This is Uvalde County." "Technicalities," Dalton said. He was watching her with the eyes of a man measuring exactly how much trouble she was going to be. "Here's the other thing. I also want Brannigan. That's personal, not legal. You step aside, let us through, and I'll forget you were involved at all." "I don't think so," she said. A silence. Then Dalton said very quietly, "Miss Callahan, there are 3 of us." "I know," she said, "and I have a rifle, and I know this canyon better than you do, and I've been sitting here for 10 minutes with time to pick my position, so unless you think Vega over there is faster than a Winchester at 40 yards, I'd say the numbers don't matter quite as much as you think." Vega, the gun hand, had gone very still. He was looking at her with professional assessment, the look of a man who recognized competence. Dalton's smile had thinned. He was recalculating. You could see it happening in his eyes. "What do you want?" he said. "Turn around," she said. "Ride back to Reyes County. Whatever Wade Hargrove owes Colt Brannigan is going to be settled in a federal court, not in this canyon. You know that. Your father knows that. The testimony is already given. You can't unring that bell." Something moved across Dalton's face, and she recognized it suddenly as fear. Not of her, of the things she had just said, that the testimony was already given, that the bell was already rung, that the worst was already done, and the only question was consequence. It was the fear of a man who had ridden 8 months on the wrong bet. She pressed it. "Go home, Dalton. Your father needs a lawyer, not a miracle, and you need to think very hard about whether you want to add assault and obstruction to what's already being investigated." The silence stretched. The canyon breathed around them. Somewhere above, on the ledge, she knew Colt was watching. She could feel it, the weight of his attention. She did not let herself look up. Dalton Hargrove pulled his horse's head around. He looked at her one more time, and in his eyes there was something that might have been grudging respect and was certainly frustration. And then he said to his men, "We're done here." They rode back the way they had come. Rose stood behind her outcrop and watched them until the sound of their horses faded to silence. Then she lowered the rifle, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she told herself, but from the aftermath of it, the adrenaline coming down. And she leaned against the cool stone and breathed. She heard movement above her and looked up. Colt was on the ledge, looking down at her. His face was unreadable from this distance, but he was still there, and that meant they were all still alive. "We're clear," she called up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, clearly, "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." Rose stood at the base of the canyon wall in the afternoon light, rifle in her hands, and felt something move through her that she did not want to examine too closely. She untied Reckoning and said, loudly enough for him to hear, "Don't push your luck, Brannigan." From above, very quietly, she heard him laugh. They came out of the canyon in the late afternoon into a world gone golden and wide, the western plains stretching before them flat and enormous, the sky already pink at the edges where the sun was beginning its descent. Del Rio was somewhere beyond that horizon, another half-day's ride, and the border beyond that. And beyond the border, a small mission school and a woman named Sister Agatha who would know what to do. They rode in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because it is itself a form of conversation. Clara rode between them and felt for the first time in years something she cautiously identified as safety. Not because the danger was past, it was not past, not by a long way. Edmund's reach was longer than one canyon confrontation, but because she was between two people who were willing to go to extraordinary lengths for her, and that was a form of safety that couldn't be bought or built. It could only be given. She thought about what Maud Connolly said to her in the parsonage over coffee, with the careful certainty of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize patterns. God doesn't always take away the trouble, dear. Sometimes he just makes sure you don't have to face it alone. Clara thought that was about right. The sun was 3 fingers above the horizon when Colt dropped back to ride beside Ro, something he had not done all day, keeping his position ahead or his distance behind, maintaining the careful geography of courtesy. She glanced at him sideways and said nothing. He rode beside her for a 1/4 mile in silence. Then he said, "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do." "You've seen a lot of cowards then," she said. "Ro." "What?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, that you had the right to the truth. You did. You always did. I made a choice 3 years ago that I thought was protection, and it was cowardice dressed up as protection, and I'm sorry for that specifically, for letting you carry the wrong version of the story." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon still, jaw set, the scar on his face catching the light. He was not a man who found apology easy. She could see that in the very structure of how he said it, the way the words came out carefully arranged, like something he had been constructing for a while. Honesty at a cost. That was worth something. "I know," she said. "I know you are." He looked at her. The amber eyes, the watchfulness, the something more than watchfulness. "My father trusted you," she said. "It was an enormous concession and she knew it, and so did he. That doesn't go away just because I was angry about it. And I think," she paused, "I think if he were here, he'd say something aggravating like, 'You know, Rowena, being right about a person takes longer than being wrong about them,' and he'd be insufferably pleased about it." Colt let out a breath. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was the cousin of one, and it changed his face entirely. Younger, less guarded, more like the man she imagined he had been before Bitter Creek and the ravine and all the heavy years of aftermath. "He sounds like he was a difficult man to argue with," Colt said. "Impossible," Ro said. "He was always right. It was one of his more irritating qualities." She paused. "He would have liked you, you know, the real version of you. The one that testified." The sentence landed between them with the weight of what it actually meant, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The horses walked on, the sun dropped lower. Clara, ahead of them, was pretending with enormous dignity not to be listening to every word. "What happens," Colt said quietly, "after Del Rio?" Ro thought about this. The honest answer was she did not know. Her mother's homestead waited with its new ring and its impending wedding, and all the complicated grief of watching the life her father had built be folded into something new. The homestead needed her, there was no one else to run it, and yet the homestead also felt, more and more, like a place she was staying out of obligation rather than belonging. "I don't know," she said. "What happens to you?" "The investigation finishes," he said, "one way or another. If it goes the way the federal judge thinks it will, Hargrove faces charges in the spring. Dalton goes with him if the obstruction can be proved." He was quiet for a moment. "After that, I don't know. I've been moving for 3 years. I don't remember what staying looks like." She thought about that, about the difference between staying because you had to and staying because you wanted to, about how those two things felt in the chest. "Maybe," she said slowly, "it looks like this." She gestured. The plain, the evening, the 3 of them on horseback in the wide-open West Texas dusk, free in the specific way that people who have chosen their own direction are free. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe it does." They rode in together as the stars began to come out, one by one, like promises. Del Rio was a border town with the particular texture of all border towns, layers of language and culture worn together into something distinct from either. The sound of Spanish and English braiding in the streets, the smell of wood smoke and chili, and the river that ran through everything like a breathing thing. They arrived in the early morning of the 4th day, trail dusty and hollow-eyed, and carrying the particular alertness of people who had been watching their backs for long enough that it had become automatic. Colt found the small inn kept by a Tejano woman named Senora Garza, who asked no questions and charged a fair price, and Clara and Ro shared a room while Colt took the one across the narrow hall, and for the first time in 4 days, they slept in beds. Clara slept for 12 hours. When she woke, Ro was sitting in the chair by the window reading, or pretending to read, an old almanac from the room's small shelf. The morning was bright and warm, and below the window, the town was going about its business in the cheerful and unhurried way that places near the border went about things. "He'll have contacted a lawyer by now," Clara said, sitting up. She meant Edmund. She always meant Edmund. He occupied the back of her mind like a creditor whose debt you could not quite escape. "Yes," Ro said. She set down the almanac. "But there's something Colt told me yesterday, something I didn't—" She paused. "I didn't tell you because you were sleeping and I wanted to let you sleep. But Clara, listen." Clara listened. What Colt had learned from a contact in Del Rio, a former federal deputy he had worked with during the Bitter Creek investigation, was that Edmund Whitfield's connection to Wade Hargrove ran deeper than the shared letter. Edmund had been a financial backer of Hargrove's political operation for years. His money had helped elect Hargrove. His influence had helped keep Hargrove's investigation quiet, which meant that when Colt's testimony landed in San Antonio, it had created legal exposure not just for Hargrove, but potentially for Edmund as well. Edmund's behavior, the letter to Dalton Hargrove, the renewed talk of the asylum, was not only about control. It was about containment. He was afraid of what Clara knew. He was afraid that if she reached a place of safety and legal protection, she would speak. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and thought about this for a long time. "He's scared," she said. "Yes," Ro said. Clara folded her hands in her lap. She looked at them, her hands, which had learned to be still and careful under Edmund's roof, which had not fully relaxed in years. She thought about Dr. Pembroke's tobacco smell. She thought about the women in the asylum who stared at nothing. She thought about Sister Agatha and what came next. "I know things," Clara said slowly. "I've been in that house for 7 years. I've seen the letters he thought I wasn't reading. I've heard the conversations he thought I couldn't hear through the walls." She looked up at Ro. "I know about the Hargrove money. I know about the land deals. I know about 3 men who were run off their property because Edmund wanted the water rights and Wade Hargrove's office was convenient to have." She paused. "I know enough to be a witness." Ro was looking at her with the expression she wore when she was recalculating something fundamental. "I don't run to hide," Clara continued. "I ran to get to a place where what I know means something, where I can say it without being immediately locked in a room and called hysterical." Her voice was steady. "I need to get to the federal court in San Antonio. I need Colt's contact, and I need to do it before Edmund figures out where I am." Ro stood up and crossed the room in 3 steps and took both of Clara's hands and held them firmly, the way she had held them 1,000 times since they were 12 years old. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. When they told Colt in the small courtyard behind Senora Garza's inn, he stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Judge Harlan Morrison, he's the federal judge on the Hargrove case. He's in San Antonio. If you can testify to financial backing of Hargrove's operation, it connects Edmund Whitfield to the conspiracy. That changes everything. It changes the scope of the case." "I know," Clara said calmly. "It also puts a target on you," he said, not warning her off, she could hear that, just naming the truth. "I've had a target on me for 7 years. At least this way, it's for something I chose." He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Ro, and something passed between them, quick and wordless, that Clara filed away and smiled about privately. "San Antonio," Colt said. "We leave tomorrow morning." The night before they left Del Rio, Clara pleaded exhaustion and retired early, leaving Ro and Colt alone in the small courtyard, where Senora Garza had set out a table with coffee and a candle. It was an obvious maneuver, and both of them knew it. Clara had never been subtle about the things she cared about. They sat across from each other in the candlelight, and for a while, they just drank their coffee and let the night breathe around them. The river sound somewhere nearby, the distant music from a cantina 2 streets over, The cicadas, because there were always cicadas. She planned this, Ro said. I know, he said. The early bedtime, the single candle, the coffee. She gestured at the table. Classic Clara May. He's been through an asylum and a bad marriage and 4 days of hard riding, he said. I figure she's earned a manipulation or two. Ro almost laughed. It surprised her, the ease of it, the way it came up without her having to decide to let it in. She looked at him across the table and thought about how different this was from the way she had looked at him in the saloon 3 days ago. 3 days, an extraordinarily short amount of time to have so many fundamental things rearranged. She thought about her father. She thought about what Seamus Callahan would say if he could see her sitting here in a courtyard in Del Rio with a candle and a cup of coffee and a man whose soul he had read correctly from the beginning. He would probably say something aggravating and accurate. He usually did. Can I ask you something? Colt said. Yes, she said. What do you want? Not for Clara, not for the case, for yourself. He was watching her with the amber eyes, the full attention that she had noticed on the first day and had been trying not to think about since. It was such a direct question that she almost deflected it with a joke or a shrug or one of the dozen other small armors she kept ready. She had been asked what she needed many times, her mother, her neighbors, the various practical demands of a working homestead. She was not often asked what she wanted. She set down her coffee. She looked at the candle. I want to stop running from the future because the past hurts. I want to stop living on a homestead that belongs to my grief instead of my life. I want... She stopped, breathed. I want to be somewhere that feels like mine, not inherited, not obligated, mine. He was quiet, listening, the way he listened, fully, without formulating a response in the middle of it. She had noticed that about him. He listened the way her father had listened. And, he said, because he could hear the and. She looked up at him. And I am aware, she said carefully, that I spent 3 years being wrong about you in a very specific way. And I am cautious about being wrong in a different direction now, just because the circumstances have been extremely dramatic, and drama tends to cloud a person's judgment. He said, That's the most careful sentence you've said to me in 4 days. I'm a careful person, she said. You walked into a canyon and faced down 3 armed men alone, he said. You are not a careful person. I'm a careful person about certain things, she amended. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, and looked at her with a directness that was one of the most unnerving things about him. No deflection, no performance, just, here is the thing I mean to say. Then let me be direct, he said. I have been in the company of many people in the past 3 years, and I have felt alone in all of it, constantly. The way you feel alone when the thing you're missing isn't company, but a specific person. And I did not know until 4 days ago who that person was, but I know now, and I am not going to call that something other than what it is, just because the circumstances are complicated. The courtyard was very quiet. The candle cast everything in amber and shadow. Ro Callahan looked at Colt Brannigan across a small table in Del Rio, Texas, and felt the last of the amber, the old, frozen grief that had kept her preserved in a particular moment of loss, crack open and give way. Not violently, gently, the way ice gives way to spring. Not all at once, but honestly. You are terrible at this, she said. He blinked. What? Telling a woman what you feel. Your delivery is all wrong. You said basically I have missed an unspecified person, and you recently identified me as that person. That is not a romantic declaration. He stared at her. Then, slowly, he started to laugh. A real laugh. Low and surprised, and entirely without armor. And Ro Callahan found that she was laughing too, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and the sound of it went up into the Del Rio night like something being released from a long captivity. When they had stopped laughing, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hands were rough and warm and entirely steady, which was more or less what she had expected. "Rowena," he said, "you are the only woman I have ever sat across a campfire from and thought, here is someone I could navigate the rest of the world with." She turned her hand over and held his. "That's better," she said. Above them, in a room on the second floor of Senora Garza's inn, Clara May Whitfield heard, faintly, the sound of laughter from the courtyard. She smiled in the dark, pressed her hands together in her lap, and said a quiet prayer of thanks to a God she had never stopped believing in, even in the years when belief had cost her the most. Judge Harlan Morrison was a compact, precise man of 60, with a silver beard trimmed close, and a way of sitting at his desk that suggested he had absorbed the weight of many difficult truths over the years, and had developed, in the process, the specific kind of calm that comes from witnessing what people are capable of, both magnificent and terrible. He looked up when they were ushered in, and his eyes moved from Colt to Roe to Clara, measuring each of them in a single sweep. He said, "Mr. Brannigan, I was wondering when you'd come back." And then to Clara, "Ma'am, I understand you have something to tell me." "Yes, sir," said Clara May Whitfield, and she sat down across from a federal judge in a room with law books on every wall and the autumn sun coming through high windows, and she told the truth. She talked for 3 hours. She talked about the money and the land deals and the conversations she had heard through walls she was never supposed to be standing beside. She talked about the letter Edmund had sent to Hargrove and the one she was certain had come back, which she had held over a steam kettle in the kitchen and read and carefully resealed because she had learned, in 7 years of marriage, to gather what information she could in whatever ways were available. She talked about the 3 ranchers who had been forced off their land. She named them, all 3, because she had memorized their names, because she had known on some deep and faithful instinct that names were the most important thing. She talked about the Whitfields' Sanitarium and what it was actually used for and what she had seen and heard there, and she was the calmest she had ever been in her life talking about the worst of it, because calm was the only weapon she had brought, and she intended to use it to the last grain. Colt sat against the wall and watched her, and thought, this woman has been preparing for this moment for years. She had not run randomly, blindly, desperately. She had run towards something. There was a difference, and that difference was everything. Roe sat beside Clara and did not take her eyes off her friend for those 3 hours, and when Clara finished, and the judge's clerk had filled several pages of careful notes, and Clara finally let herself exhale, a long, slow release, like a vessel that had been holding too much pressure for too long, Roe reached over and took her hand and held it, and did not let go. Judge Morrison sat back in his chair. He looked at the clerk. He looked at Colt. He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "you understand that what you have described opens a formal inquiry not just into Hargrove, but into your husband as well." "Yes," said Clara. "You understand that Mr. Whitfield will likely respond to this with every legal and social tool available to him, that he will attempt to use your history of confinement to discredit your testimony." "Yes," said Clara, "I have been expecting that since before I left the house." "And you are prepared for that?" Clara May Whitfield sat up a little straighter in her chair. She was still trail-dusted from the road. She had a week's-old bruise on her cheekbone that was fading now to yellow at the edges, the slow color of a wound learning to heal. She was 31 years old, and she had not slept a full, unguarded night in 7 years. And she said, in the quiet, certain voice of someone who has finally arrived at the place they have been traveling toward for a very long time, "Your Honor, I have been prepared for that since the morning I decided I was worth fighting for." A silence settled over the room, the particular kind of silence that follows a sentence that means more than its words. Then Judge Morrison said simply and without ceremony, "Very well. The case broke open over the following weeks like a dam that had been quietly cracking for a long time and finally found the right pressure. Edmund Whitfield, when a federal marshal arrived at the Whitfield estate with a notice of formal inquiry, made a series of decisions that a wiser or less frightened man would not have made. He engaged a lawyer who reviewed the evidence and immediately recommended cooperation. Edmund refused. He attempted to have Clara's original asylum commitment papers submitted to the court as proof of mental instability. The court declined to admit them as relevant. He wrote furious letters to men he believed were allies, and received in return a silence that told him everything he needed to know about the nature of alliances built on money and fear. And then he made the last and most fatal of his errors. He wrote to Dalton Hargrove. The letter was not intercepted this time. It reached Dalton at a small ranch south of Uvalde, where he had been keeping himself scarce since the canyon confrontation, and Dalton read it twice, and his face went through several things: calculation, contempt, and finally a cold, settled decision. Edmund Whitfield had written to say that he was prepared to provide additional details about the Hargrove financial operation in exchange for leniency in his own case. He had named names, he had cited specific transactions, he had short offered to give Dalton's father to the federal government in order to save himself. Dalton Hargrove folded the letter very carefully and put it in his breast pocket and told Vega and Sutter to saddle up. He was not going to let Edmund Whitfield testify. Meanwhile, in San Antonio, Clara was slowly, quietly, carefully beginning to remember who she was. She took long walks along the San Antonio River in the mornings when the light came in low and golden, and the water carried the sound of the city waking up. She found a small, upright piano at the boarding house where she and Roe were staying, tucked against the parlor wall, under a painting of the hill country that someone had attempted with more ambition than skill, and she sat down at it one evening, almost without deciding to, and began to play. The sound surprised her. How much of her hands remembered, how much of herself had been stored in music, while everything else was being systematically dismantled. She played for an hour, and Rose sat on the settee listening and did not say a word, and when Clara finally stopped, they both sat in the silence for a while, and it was the good kind of silence. She wrote letters to her sisters, letters that told the truth for the first time in years about where she had been and what had happened and what she hoped for. She received letters back, stunned, then furious on her behalf, then tearfully relieved, and the words of her sisters, whom she had been kept from for so long, were like water on ground that had been dry for years. She planted herbs on the windowsill of her room, first rosemary, then mint, then a small brave pot of basil that caught the afternoon sun and smelled every time she passed it like a kitchen where someone was cooking with love. She did not know on the evening she planted the basil that 40 miles away, Edmund Whitfield had received a visitor at the Whitfield estate, that a visitor had arrived at dark by the back road, that Esperanza, who had been watching the house and praying quietly and steadily since the morning Clara left, had seen the light go on in Edmund's study and had heard voices, 2 of them, and then had heard a single sharp sound that was not quite like anything she had heard before. She did not know yet, but the Lord knew, and the Lord, who sees all things, and in whose hands the scales of justice have always rested, had not forgotten Clara May Whitfield. He never had.
The knock at Clara's boarding house door came early on a Tuesday morning, before the rest of the house had fully stirred. Roe answered it, hand on the knife at her hip from habit, and found on the threshold a young man in a marshal's deputy uniform who looked uncomfortable in the way that people look when they are carrying news they did not choose to carry. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm looking for a Mrs. Clara May Whitfield. I have a communication for her from the Reyes County Sheriff's Office, forwarded through the Federal Marshal's Service." Roe looked at him for a long moment. Something in the set of his face told her what kind of communication it was before a word of it was spoken. She said, "Wait here," and closed the door and went to Clara's room. Clara was already awake, sitting at the window with her Bible open on her lap. She had returned to it slowly, painfully over the past weeks, like a person learning to use an injured hand, finding that what she had feared would be broken was still, against all expectation, intact. She looked up when Ro came in and read Ro's face the way she had always been able to read Ro's face. "What is it?" she said. Ro sat down on the edge of the bed. She chose her words carefully, not to soften the truth, but to give it its proper weight. "There is a deputy marshal at the door with a communication from Reyes County." She paused. "Clara, I think it is about Edmund." Clara set down her Bible very slowly. She looked at her hands in her lap. Her face was still, not the careful stillness she had worn for 7 years as a form of armor, but a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a person who has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for a weight they have carried so long it had become part of their posture. "Bring him in," she said. The deputy's communication was brief and precise in the manner of official documents. Edmund Harlan Whitfield had been found deceased at the Whitfield estate on the morning of October the 9th. The cause of death, pending the county physician's final determination, was consistent with a single gunshot wound. The property had been secured. A federal investigation into the circumstances was underway. As his wife and next of kin, Mrs. Whitfield was being formally notified. Clara read the document twice. Then she folded it in her lap and looked at the window for a long moment, at the ordinary San Antonio morning going about its business outside. The wagon in the street, the pigeons on the eaves, the thin October sunshine doing its best. The deputy, to his credit, did not hurry her. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry. Not because she felt nothing. Clara May had never been a woman who felt nothing, but because what she felt was too large and too complicated for a single expression to contain. There was grief in it. Grief for the man Edmund might have been, for the marriage that had lived only in hope and never in reality, for the years she would never recover. There was fear's absence, and that absence was so enormous after 7 years that it felt almost like a presence of its own, a space in her chest where something heavy had been removed, and the breath came differently now, clearer, deeper. There was the recognition, quiet and solemn, that she had not caused this. She had not wished for it. She had simply gone to a judge and told the truth. And Edmund's own choices, the briberies, the conspiracies, the wicked letter to a wicked man, had set in motion consequences that no amount of legal maneuvering or medical documentation could stop. She thought of Proverbs, which her mother had read to her as a girl. The righteousness of the upright delivers them, but the treacherous are taken captive by their own greed. She thought, Edmund built his cage himself. I just refused to live in it with him. "Thank you," she said to the deputy, and her voice was steady. "I will be in touch with the county office regarding the arrangements." The deputy nodded, relieved to have the thing done, and left. In the silence that followed, Ro did not speak. She sat beside Clara and let the silence be what it needed to be, a container large enough to hold everything without requiring any of it to be resolved quickly. This was one of the things Ro was best at, and one of the reasons Clara had trusted her above all others. She understood that some moments needed room, not words. After a long time, Clara said quietly, "I never stopped praying for him, you know, even at the end. Even from the way station with the storm outside." She looked at her hands. "I prayed that God would reach him, that something in him would turn. I believe God heard that prayer. I believe God answered it in his own way, in his own time. That is not the answer I would have chosen." She paused. "But I have learned not to argue with the Almighty about the shape of his mercies." Ro put her arm around her friend. Clara leaned in, just a slightly. "You are free," Ro said, not triumphantly, gently, as a fact that deserved to be spoken aloud. Clara closed her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." Later that day, when they told Colt, who received the news with the particular controlled stillness of a man processing something significant, he stood at the window of Judge Morrison's outer office for a long time, looking at the street. Then he said, "Dalton Hargrove." "Almost certainly," Ro said. "He'll be taken," Colt said. "The investigation will find him. A man like Dalton doesn't disappear, he leaves tracks." He turned from the window. "It won't be fast, but it will be thorough." Edmund chose his associations, Clara said, from the chair where she was sitting with her hands folded and her face composed. He chose them freely over many years, knowing what they were. I spent 7 years believing I was the broken one, that I was the source of every problem in that house. She looked up at Colt. "It is a peculiar thing to realize that the cage was never as strong as you believed, that it was held together by your own fear more than his locks." Colt looked at her with something that might have been the deepest kind of respect. "What will you do now?" he asked. Clara considered the question, really considered it, as though the future was hers to think about, hers to plan, hers to want things from. "There are girls in this county who are growing up believing the same things I believed, that they are not worth much, that their voices do not carry, that the cages are stronger than they are." She paused. "I think I would like to open a school, a proper one, not finishing, not manners and embroidery, a real education, letters and numbers and history and how to think for yourself and how to read a legal document and know what it says." Her voice had gained something as she spoke, a certainty that had always been in her, but had been systematically covered over, and now was slowly coming back to the surface like a creek after a drought. "I have money enough from the estate to begin. I have this city. I have friends who will help." She looked at Ro. "You will help." "Obviously," Ro said. Clara looked at Colt. "And you will put in the bookshelves." He blinked. Then his mouth curved, that rare, unguarded smile. "I'll build you whatever you need," he said. Clara May Whitfield, widow, nodded once with quiet satisfaction, and for the first time in 7 years, she began to plan a future that was entirely, irrevocably her own. The letter from Pearl Callahan came on a Thursday morning in the second week of October, written in Pearl's careful script on the good stationery she kept for correspondence that mattered. Ro read it at the small table in the boarding house kitchen, with her coffee going cold beside her and the early light coming through the window in long, pale angles. She read it twice. Then she folded it and sat for a while looking at nothing in particular, doing the slow internal work of sorting through what she felt about what it said. Colt came in from outside. He had been with the horses, the early morning habit of a man who took better care of animals than most people took of themselves, and poured his own coffee and sat down across from her. He looked at the letter in her hands. He looked at her face. "Bad news?" he said. "I don't know," she said, and she meant it. "My mother is getting married next month. She wants me to come home for the wedding." Colt was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was thinking past the surface of a thing. "Will you?" Ro thought about Pearl and the new ring she had noticed in the summer, before any of this had started, that small gold circle catching the light at the dinner table, Pearl's hand moving quickly to cover it when she saw Ro looking, the complicated conversation that had not happened yet between them. She thought about her own anger at the idea of the homestead changing, and she looked at that anger honestly, the way her father had always taught her to look at hard things, straight on, in good light, without flinching. She found, when she looked at it honestly, that it was not really anger at all. It was grief wearing anger's coat, because grief was too exposed to go outside undressed. Pearl was not betraying Seamus by choosing to live again. Seamus would have hated nothing more than to know his death had sealed Pearl inside a life of solitude and unending mourning. He had been a man who loved life with his whole chest, who sang while he worked and laughed at his own jokes and genuinely believed that every morning was a gift that deserved to be received with both hands. He would have looked at Pearl's new ring and said, "Good. Good for you, woman. Don't waste a single day." Ro felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. "Yes," she said. "I'll go." Colt nodded. There was a pause, and then, with the studied casualness of a man who very much wanted to hear the answer to a question he was trying not to appear to be asking, he said, "And after?" She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his coffee cup.
She had noticed over the weeks in San Antonio how he moved through the world, the economy of it, the quiet purposefulness, the way he was always slightly aware of every door in whatever room he occupied, not from paranoia, but from long practice. She had noticed the way he listened, fully, the way her father had listened. She had noticed, with a frankness she permitted herself only in the private accounting of her own thoughts, that she had begun to look for him when he was not in the room, and that when he was, the room felt different in a way she could not reduce to anything simple or dismissible. She had been careful about this. She had been careful the way she was always careful about the things that mattered most, measuring, checking, refusing to be swept by the drama of circumstance into a feeling that might dissolve when the circumstances settled. She had asked herself in the honest dark of several nights, is this real? Or is this the story playing tricks? The compressed intimacy of shared danger, the gratitude of having someone prove himself trustworthy, the old, deep longing for her father that had not gone away and never would. She had not been able to dismiss it. She had tried. After the wedding, she said carefully, I need to talk to my mother about the homestead. I think Pearl will go where Thomas goes, which means the land needs tending. She met his eyes. I'm not built for the city, Brannigan. I never was. I need a fence line and a sky big enough to think in. She paused. And I think you've been moving for 3 years because moving felt safer than staying. But moving isn't the same as living. He was very still. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. I'm saying I know what I need. I'm saying the Callahan land will need someone with a strong back and a long memory for the work. And I am saying that if after the case is settled and the dust is down and ordinary life comes back, if you still feel the way you said you felt in Del Rio, then, she stopped, breathed, then we should talk about it properly, not in the middle of a crisis, just as people, as ourselves. Colt set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said, for a woman who walked into a canyon alone against 3 armed men, you take a great deal of time getting to the point. She almost laughed. It surprised her. I am careful about the things that are worth being careful about. Rowena, he said her full name, which he rarely did, and there was a quality in the saying of it that made the careful architecture she had built around the conversation feel suddenly less important than just listening. I spent 3 years being someone who kept moving because everything behind me hurt. I do not want to be that person anymore. I want to be the kind of person who stays in one place long enough for the ground to know his name. He looked at her steadily. I want to be where you are. That is the whole and complete truth of it. And I can wait for ordinary life and proper conversations if that is what you need. But I am not going to pretend I don't know what I want, because I have wasted enough time doing that already. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a church bell began to ring the hour. Ro Callahan looked at Colt Brannigan across a kitchen table in a San Antonio boarding house, with her cold coffee and his honesty and the October sun coming through the window, and she decided, not impulsively, not recklessly, but with her whole considered self, that she was done being so careful that she missed the things worth reaching for. All right, she said. He blinked. All right? All right, she said again. We'll talk about it properly, after. She picked up her coffee. Now drink yours before it gets cold. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was entirely unguarded and entirely real. Then he picked up his coffee, and the church bell rang, and the morning went on, and down the hall Clara May was playing the piano again, something old and hymn-like and quietly triumphant, and the notes came through the wall like a benediction. In the spring of 1885, a federal jury in San Antonio convicted Wade Hargrove on 6 counts of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in the death of Seamus Callahan. His sentence was 12 years in federal prison. Dalton Hargrove was arrested in Laredo in December, identified by the federal investigation as the man responsible for Edmund Whitfield's death. A conclusion arrived at by the kind of careful, methodical evidence gathering that Colt Brannigan had been instrumental in organizing, because he had found, in the end, that the most useful thing he could do with all those years of carrying guilt was to put them to work. Dalton received 20 years. Vega and Sutter received lesser sentences in exchange for testimony. It was not a perfect resolution. Justice rarely is. But it was thorough, and it was real. And the men who had destroyed Seamus Callahan's life and terrorized Clara May Whitfield and corrupted the law they were supposed to serve were off the land and behind walls. And that was something. That was, in fact, a great deal. Clara May Whitfield, widow, free woman, and one of the most formidable witnesses Judge Harlan Morrison said he had encountered in 30 years on the bench, used her portion of the Whitfield estate, administered through the court during the investigation, to establish the San Antonio School for Young Women on a tree-lined street 2 blocks from the river. It was a real school. Letters and arithmetic and history and rhetoric and civics and scripture, taught by women who believed that the girls in front of them were worth teaching everything. It was not a fashionable institution, and it was not a wealthy one, and it was always full. She never remarried. She did not need to. She had found in the wreckage of what her marriage had been something she had not expected to find: herself, whole, capable, rooted. She had given her years to a man who tried to diminish her, and God, in his sovereignty, had not allowed that diminishment to be permanent. She carried the scars of it honestly and without shame, the way a healed bone carries the memory of its break, not as a wound, but as evidence of what survived. She planted a garden behind the school. It grew extravagantly. Pearl Callahan married Thomas Garrett on a cold, bright November morning at the little church in Uvalde, with Rose standing up beside her and Colt sitting in the third pew looking like a man who was not entirely comfortable in church clothes, but was determined to be decent about it. Pearl wept with happiness throughout the ceremony. Thomas wept briefly and pretended he had not. Roe cried once quietly at the part where the minister said, "in sickness and in health," and did not apologize for it. She had a long talk with Pearl the morning of the wedding, in the kitchen of the homestead that Seamus Callahan had built with his own stubborn hands. She told Pearl what she had decided about the land. Pearl listened. When Roe finished, Pearl reached across the table and held Roe's face in both hands, the way mothers hold the faces of their children when they are trying to memorize them, and said, "Your father would be so proud of you, Rowena, not just for surviving, for choosing." Pearl and Thomas moved to his ranch in Uvalde in December. The Callahan homestead became Roe's, legally, entirely, hers in a way it had never quite been before. And in the spring, when the bluebonnets came up along the Nueces and the river ran silver and fast with the melting of whatever small mountain snow Texas could arrange, a gray roan horse named Asylum arrived in the Callahan yard, and his rider dismounted with a saddlebag over one shoulder and a look on his face of a man who had ridden a very long way and was at last done riding. Roe was on the porch. She had seen him coming from the road. Colt Brannigan stood in the yard and looked at the homestead, the solid adobe house, the live oaks along the river, the wide sky doing its particular West Texas thing with the light at that hour, and then he looked at Roe. She looked back at him with the dark, direct eyes that did not conceal what they were feeling anymore, not from him, because she had decided in a San Antonio kitchen in October that she was done being so careful she missed things. "You're late," she said. "Spring's half over." He said, "I had to finish the case, and I built you something." She raised an eyebrow. He reached into the saddlebag and pulled out a flat-wrapped parcel and brought it up to the porch and set it on the railing between them. She unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden sign, hand-carved and sanded smooth, with letters burned deep and clean into the grain. Callahan, Brannigan. She looked at it for a long time. "That's presumptuous," she said. "I know," he said. "You haven't asked me anything properly yet." "I know," he said again. "I was working up to it."
He looked at her steadily, with everything right there in his face. No armor, no distance, just the truth of a man who has been lost for a long time and has found the place where lost things stop. Rowena Callahan, I would like to stay here. I would like to fix your fence line and re-roof your barn and learn this land the way it deserves to be learned. I would like to build a life beside you, not because you need me, because you very clearly do not, but because I believe God put us in each other's path for a reason that neither of us could have engineered and both of us almost missed, and I do not want to miss it anymore. He paused. That is as close to properly as I know how to get. Ro Callahan picked up the wooden sign from the porch railing and looked at it once more. Then she set it back on the railing and said, The east fence line is a disaster. The barn roof is worse, and there's a stretch of the riverbank that floods in spring and needs grading. I know, he said. Clara told me. She's already managing you and you've been here 3 minutes, Ro said. He sent instructions. He also sent this. He reached into the saddlebag again and produced a small jar of preserved peaches. Ro looked at the peaches. She looked at Colt. Something moved across her face, slow, warm, and entirely undefended. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes? Yes to all of it, she said. Now come inside and I'll put the coffee on. You look like you've been riding for a week. 3 days, he said. Close enough, she said, and opened the door. He picked up the Callahan-Brannigan sign from the porch railing as he followed her inside. He would find a nail for it tomorrow. Tonight was coffee and a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and wood smoke and the particular quality of peace that comes when a long journey is over, and you are, without question, exactly where you are supposed to be. Down in San Antonio, a school full of girls was learning to read, and Clara May was teaching them, and outside her window the garden was coming up green and extravagant and entirely uncontained. And at the Callahan homestead on the Nueces, the light burned in the window through the evening and into the night, not because anyone had forgotten to turn it off, because someone had finally, after a very long time, come home. Friends, we have come to the end of Where the Rivers Run Red. Clara Lay never filed for divorce. She never asked God to break what he had joined, even when what had been joined had hurt her deeply. She prayed instead for justice, for safety, for truth to stand up in the light. And God, who hates the shedding of innocent blood just as he hates the putting away of a wife, answered in his own sovereign, unhurried, unmistakable way. That is the God of this story. That is the God of every story on this channel. Not a God who is slow to see our suffering, but a God whose timing is perfect, whose justice is certain, and whose love for his children does not waver even when the night is long. If this story moved your heart today, if Clara's endurance spoke to something in you, if Ro's forgiveness challenged you, if Colt's long road to redemption gave you hope, then you already know what the blessed Christian storyteller is about. It is not just stories, it's the truth hiding inside them, that God is faithful, that broken things can be mended, and that we are never as alone as we fear. Please like this video if it blessed you today, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story, and share it with a friend, a sister, a mother, anyone who is in a long night right now and needs to hear that the morning is coming, that God sees them, that the light is already on. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And until next time, keep believing, keep trusting, keep going, beloved. Where the rivers run red with trial, God is already preparing the place where they run clear.